Thank you, Elena. I'm very honored to be here. NYU was a place where I developed side by side with the critical activity, creative activity, and I feel a debt to this place. I believe I go first because the poet with whom I begin belongs to the first part of the 20th century, that I think we follow the rough chronological profile. As in all occasions of this sort, but I believe especially when poetry is concerned, much depends on the kairos, on the moment, the sense of the moment. I originally thought of starting right away with the voice of a poet, the great avant-garde Italian poet Marinetti, of whom we are going to hear a very short piece, 3 minutes. But then I thought that I would like to briefly introduce not him, but the situation, because hearing this old record may sound funny to us now, and that I think I submit to be the wrong reaction. What you're going to hear, and the person who is going to present it is a graduate student at Columbia, not a lowly graduate student charged with handling the machines, but the leading, the leading expert on the philology of, textual philology of Marinetti, Patrizio Ceccagnoli, who will, in a moment, set up this CD. This CD is a registration called Musica Futurista, the Art of Noises. The piece you're going to hear was originally recorded in April 1924 for the Società Italiana Nazionale del Grammofono, and so you will hear a not perfect recording. You should have in front of you the Italian text and the English version of what Marinetti is saying, although there is not a full correspondence. You got to listen to it very much an oral performance. The text, in a certain sense, belongs to Zang Tun Tun, the onomatopoetic title of a book that appeared in 1914 and that, in my opinion, is the great, the definitive modernistic poem of the century, of the 20th century. But this is a kind of prova di stampa. It's a first partial publication, appeared in 1913, called Bombardamento di Adrianopoli, the bombardment of Adrianople. Briefly, very briefly, it describes, it alludes to, this is part of a much longer poem, the Bulgarian siege of Adrianople in Turkey that began on October 1912 and lasted until the spring of the following year, during what is noted as the First Balkan War. Marinetti was at Adrianople in October 1912, and so he had a first-hand experience of the early days of the campaign. You'll hear some Bulgarian words, Shumi, Maritsa, Karvavena, which are the first line of the Bulgarian national anthem, and you'll hear the name Ibrahim Pasha, who was the senior commander at the south sector of Adrianople. The bombs, to me, and I don't want to predetermine your reaction, but the explosions that you hear are in a deep sense real, it seems to me, and rather scary. I have had only one experience, a war tourist experience, so to speak, of mortar shots. It seems to me that Marinetti reproduction of them is remarkably realistic. Also, from a more aesthetic point of view, I think you can feel, sense here, one of the basic genealogies of contemporary experimental poetry, what is called concrete poetry. There are only 3 minutes, and I'll ask Patrizio to...
Bombarda, Trento di Adrianopoli, parole di libertà. Ogni 5 secondi cannoni d'assedio entrare spazio con un accordo. Senti, tu. Annunziamento 500 echi per accannarlo, lottato, battagliato, all'infinito. Nel centro di quei tutti afghani, anch'essa di 50 km quadrati, saltare, coppie, fugli, fanterie, tirolati, violenza. affanno, orecchie, occhi, narici, aperte, attenti, e poi a vedere, udire, scusare, tutto, caracatati di partiti, e in aria capitate, morti, stati, acá, viva Brodum, viva Brodum, viva Brodum, viva Brodum, viva di salti, attentamente, lui in fondo all'orchestra, tanto, guardare, vuoi, dunque, carne, no, il pennarsi cavalli, il partinti, tirano i primi, e battere di polvere in marca, arpavena, tudum, e per domanda colpi partenza, colpi arrivo, prima di senza vedere quel cacciatore, fammi qua, fammi là, in boom, su, tua testa, attenzione, ciao! Pompe, raggiungete quel tubo, tu che faccia, comunica telefonicamente con quelli che siete forti in tutti e diretto. Allora Ibrahim, Rudolf, allora, attore e uomo. Egli per voi, per aria di studio. Foresti, outdown, odore di prima quando osservo, non sento più i miei piedi grassi. Odore di marcio, timpo e saltarino, dovunque passo alto, tu che di inventare e attitudinando i passi, attorno in questo orchestra, questi passatissimi, suonare, pronti favori, non cancellare, anzi, questi danni tagliandoli, invisibili canti, fretta, punta, fiumi in lusso, ragazzi, pentonata, suonando incasinata, ascoltando, glu lacrime e ricordi verdi, monti rodi, scritti, venire, case, esplodere, appresso io di d'oro, rapare con canti, capitature derissime, orchestra, il rumore di guerra, con fianchi, una nota di silenzio, tenuta nell'alto cielo, pallone, serico, dorato, sorvegliare, istinto.
Parole in libertà, words in freedom is a classic vocabulary. Of course, the time is short and we not right for an exegesis of futurism that has been ceaselessly rehearsed last year, tiptoeing, I think, around some of the central questions. But what is this all about? It seems to me that this is all about the necessity that we should have to rewrite the history of European culture in the first half of the 20th century in a nexus of achievements and tragedies. The last quote I have from Marinetti is from an unpublished novel of 1943-1944, The Other End of the Parable. Certo che lo smarrirsi è piacevole e atroce. To be sure, getting lost is both sweet and atrocious. At a certain point, the poet uses the expression violenza. Violence is an alarming word, but we cannot not look at it. And we have to create a necessary space for the understanding and even the necessary piety, it seems to me, around this word. Marinetti is one of the few Italian representatives, but there are many other European representatives, of what I would call literature at the extreme, or extreme literature. Extreme is a word that has become almost kitschy now. Extreme pizza. It's there's something serious behind it. It seems to me describes a kind of crossroads of intense human and too human, and perhaps also not entirely human experiences of access, dépense, I'm of course alluding to Bataille, experience of violence in all its phenomenology that includes pain, degradation, disfigurement, abjections, and so forth, and that becomes institutionalized in the ritual of war. And all these phenomena move under the how should I say, protecting shadow of evil, the notion of evil. But it seems to me that extreme literature is not necessarily a literature that is indifferent or immoralistic. Marinetti participates passionately, I think, in his writing and life to the conflict of values and disvalues. And I dare say that in his attitude there is something sacrificial. It is as if he would like to give space in his work to the least defensible voices to see until what point one could go. It's as if he would be a ventriloquist of violence, so to speak. And this seems, to me, seems to imply the opposite of indifference or indifferentism. And I think in this sense, Marinetti is probably unique. And this explains why his work, his real poetic work, is still largely ignored. He's probably unique in the panorama of Italian literature, modern and contemporary Italian literature, and remains one of the indispensable creative witnesses of what I call the indissoluble nexus, node connection of conquests and tragedies that characterize the 20th century. I would also suggest, and then coming to the end of my few remarks, that only he who has a strong sense of values can describe with real poetic eloquence the disvalue, the contrary of values. A fashionable thinker of the 80s, a French thinker, of course, says, "Nous ne savons plus dire le mal." We cannot say evil, we cannot express evil anymore. This is Jean Baudrillard, but I think he was wrong. He was wrong in the 80s, he was wrong in the 30s, he was wrong. It was not today, with all respect. I mean, you know, we can, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, but we can always express evil. I don't see any difficulty there in a sense. I mean, I don't see a panorama of indifference and inertia ever at the time of Marinetti and in our time. There are questions that you posed. I mean, I guess Ellen and John posed. That, of course, I don't presume to answer. I think all of us, I suppose, will be a definite answer to these questions. But I would personally distinguish between what I call the normative questions and the descriptive questions. The question is, what is the task of poetic language in representing violence? The second question is, should there be an ethical form in poetry about or regarding war and violence? Well, my answer to that would be no. I do not believe that poetic language has or should have a task, and I would not believe that poetic language should be associated with any should there be an ethical form. I understand better all the other questions that are, seems to me, descriptive. They describe, that they ask us to reflect about certain phenomena, and the influence of everyday representation of violence and so forth and so on. And all of this, although, as I say, I don't have answers, I think, but I am worried about assigning any task to poetic language and any ethical form to poetic language. Poetic language should go the way it goes. We should reflect about it, but not prescribe. That would be my response. There is a question that bothers me, worries me, and to which, of course, is any really important question I don't have an answer. Must one have experienced or seen violence in order to write about it? I don't know. I didn't see war. I didn't see fire, as you say. My father did. A French writer, I think, who says, my father fought this war. He's alluding to the Vendée War during the French Revolution, and I can speak about it. I do not know if I can speak about a war my father fought as opposed to a war I fought. I don't know. And I'm trying to answer it. The most I try to do is to reflect about it in my own poetry, which, of course, I do not presume to set against Marinetti. I consider Marinetti a great and indispensable poet. So, of course, this is not the case. I also note that I do not have anything common with his idea of poetry. My idea of poetry, I think, is more traditional and contemplative and religiously interested. But I admire in the other and the difference. We are often exhorted to think of the other, to think of the difference. Very often in context where it's the opposite of difference is at work. So I will conclude with reading to you two poems that I believe you have in front of you in the English text. They have to do with violence, not with war. I'm not prepared to write about war. One of them is taken by a collection called Il dialogo del falco e dell'avvoltoio, dialogo of the hawk and the vulture. And I will read to you a relatively long poem called Il pasto dell'avvoltoio, the virtues banquet, which refers to a site that is familiar, I think, to many of you. It's been described also by Italian poets in their travelogues. I think of Pasolini, I think of Moravia, the impressive towers of silence that on the outskirts of what is now called Mumbai, but I call Bombay because I visited that many years ago. It was still Bombay. Are a particular kind of burial ground that is described in the poem. I'll read the poem in Italian, but I think you have the text in front of you. Il pasto dell'avvoltoio. Morire è facile, ma essere sepolti è un'arte filosofica. Bisogna farsi seppellire col vestito del dì delle nozze. Tu riaffermi la linea di una vita con un solo vestito buono, dallo sposalizio alla terra, sperando che così ritroverai al taglio decisivo e sopra l'ultima lama della luce di coscienza i padri dei tuoi padri. Le madri dovrebbero sopravvivere ai figli per poterli piangere degnamente, solo esse, esperte in corruzione delicata, in cure morbide, in vizio dolce dei figli, solo le beneficamente corrotte sanno fare il corrotto sul cadavere. Il vestito all'antica è un argine di stoffa, ma non è semplice la vita che così muore. Troppe radici terrose si intralciano a fiore di terra. Caccia le nicchie libere, gara di cadaveri ammonticchiati che attendono i turni. Tutta la terra dunque è sconsacrata da cupidigia di picchetti e pali. Territorio vien da terrore. La spada scava terra, poi subito scava il collo. Dicono i parsi: la terra è sacra, dunque non può essere polluta dal cadavere. L'acqua è sacra e non può essere intorbidita da carcasse. Il fuoco è sacro, dunque non può essere profanato bruciando un corpo. L'aria è sacra, non può essere offuscata dal cielo. Quale luogo allora al cadavere? La tomba semovente che preclude tutti gli elementi, li taglia fuori dalla sua angusta volta buia, l'avvoltoio. A volte ho pensato il contrario. Terra e acqua, fuoco e aria, sono tutti polluti e bruttati, nessuno degno più di ospitare l'unico simulacro di purezza, il corpo umano. Ma, mentre cammino lungo il viale grande, Bombay ai piedi sotto la collina, osservando le torri del silenzio, comprendo di dover tornare alla chiara visione dei parsi, l'avvoltoio. Angusti pozzi profondi, torri rovesciate, dentro il ventre, dentro la terra. Là sono gettati i cadaveri e su tutte le palme intorno gli avvoltoi ristanno, grandi, cupri, albi, con i colli incassati tra le spalle. Gli avvoltoi sono filosofi nudi, mostrano quanto assurdo sia il filosofo vestito. Gli avvoltoi sono critici. Prima di ogni altro membro ingoiano gli occhi. Nel loro stomaco la morte si purifica, la ruota si riavvia. The second and last poem is extremely short, but it necessitates a short introduction. I know it's kind of absurd with the introduction to the poem, basically longer than the poem, but I really have to explain. I'm not an admirer of necessarily of Pedro Almodovar, but I was struck by a film of his that I saw a few years ago, and that in Spanish is called Hable con ella, Talk to Her. And it's the story of a dancer, I believe, that he's in a coma and then gets out of the coma. There is a secondary figure that struck me and it drew my attention. And this is a female bullfighter, by the way. English is really here a bit heavy. In Italian, it just changes a vowel. Torero, torera, that's it. Female bullfighter seems to be a bit bureaucratic, but anyway, it's a woman who is a bullfighter. Okay? And she takes risk. I think she takes a big risk in the arena with the bull. Is wounded, and as the coma victim is recovering, the torera dies. I was very impressed by this image, and the poet imagines to be the woman, and the woman is scared and prays to herself. She prays to herself as she's waiting for the bull. Ti aspetto inginocchiata sull'arena. Prego le mie mammelle, costrette nel corpetto. Prego le mie spalle larghe, sotto lustrini e mostrine. Ecco il rompitoro, locomotiva della coscienza esterna e schiacciante.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here and sorry for the long bio. I should have sent you a shorter one. I had fantasies about writing a manifesto, but this was a very bad week, so I'm just going to say a few things anecdotally, because I think it's important that I kind of the cultural genealogy that I belong to partially is that I grew up in Iraq and started writing there and still write in Arabic, the poetry, and translate it. But in terms of the issue of war and poetry and representation, in the Arab world, I think, and Iran as well, poetry in a way seems to matter a little bit more, and seems to be a more intense activity where poets lose their lives and are exiled, and where poems can start demonstrations, and where poetry is recited to survive torture, that now we know, for example, the poems of Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet. But poetry is very important, and I happened to grow up, come of age, that's one poetic, during the Iran-Iraq war. So my first experience was when culture is controlled by a totalitarian system, and where poetry mattered a lot, and all poets were supposed to glorify the war and dehumanize the Iranians, and people lost their lives. So for me, there was never a delinkage. And we saw this in practice, whereby we would take our poems to the literary editors, and they would say, you know, this is very beautiful, you're talented, but I can't publish this because the mother of the soldier killed is crying, and she's not supposed to be crying. Now, at that time, though, the way we made sense of the world was that we would receive poems recorded on cassette tapes from Iraqi poets living in exile. So we always were aware that there is this space that poets can occupy, and that role that they can play. Now, coming into this country, and in a way I'm forced to fill this role of the native informant somehow, or the token Iraqi, whatever, but that's why your presentation was very important, that I'm horrified by this amnesia, and by how war is completely irrelevant, the two wars, to a horrifying extent, so that I was invited, for example, by a peace group on one of the college campuses. When I was speaking, I said, you know, this country is waging two wars, and one of the students who's a member of the peace group told me, Professor, I know about the Iraq war, but what's the other war? So I think where there are features with all previous wars, but I think this is a unique moment, and I mean, there are exceptions, but for example, the conference of the American AWP, from hundreds and hundreds of panels, there was one panel about the war. It was co-organized by Arab American poets. So I am forced to write about these things that are happening, but I always have this fantasy, which Darwish had, the fantasy of, had he not been Palestinian, that would be the ethical question. So I have to write about these things, and we have the same problem in the Arab world, because a lot of these, after the decline of the grand narratives, and the fact that some of the most atrocious, barbaric regimes had kind of appropriated all these discourses of social justice, made it passé to write political poetry. So we have the same problem in the Arab world, whereby those of us who write about poetry and violence are chastised as being passé or ideological poets. I don't know how helpful that is, but I thank you for the opportunity to read the poetry, which is more eloquent than my preface, I hope. So I will start also chronologically. First poem was written when the second Gulf War started in 1991, and it's always, I find it necessary but important to remind Americans that this is the second time around when this country goes and destroys another country. 1991 is completely forgotten. But anyway, simply, this poem is entitled Wars. When I was torn by war, I took a brush immersed in death and drew a window on war's wall. I opened it, searching for something, but all I saw was another war, and a mother weaving a shroud for the dead man still in her womb. A Prisoner's Song is a poem dedicated to the POWs of the Iraq-Iran war on both sides. It's dedicated to the Iranian Americans involved, yes. From the distant fog, after communiques had withered and cannons stopped spitting, he returned soaked with the distance. His silence an umbrella under our ululation. He passed by us, through us, to his old room. The lute was still there. Its strings in their wooden exile yearned for his rainy fingers. But he never touched it. What language could explain that 8 years had gnawed 10 fingers? The next poem is in short sections. It's entitled Wrinkles on the Wind's Forehead. It was written in 2003 while watching the war on TV. 1. The wind is a blind mother stumbling over the corpses. No shrouds except the clouds, but the dogs are much faster. The moon is a graveyard for light. The stars, women wailing. The wind was tired of carrying the coffins. It leaned against a palm tree. A satellite inquired, "Where to now?" The silence in the wind's cane murmured, "Baghdad," and the palm tree caught fire. The soldiers' fingers scrape and scrabble like question marks or sickles. They search the womb of the wind for weapons. Nothing but smoke and depleted uranium. My heart is a stork perched on a distant dome in Baghdad. Its nest is made of bones, its sky of death. This is not the first time myths wash their face with our blood. There they are, looking into the horizon's mirror as they don our bones. War salivates, tyrants and historians pant, and a wrinkle smiles on the face of a child who will play during a break between wars. The Euphrates is a long procession. Cities pat its shoulders as palm trees weep. The child plays in time's garden, but war calls upon her from inside. Come on in. The grave is a mirror into which the child looks and dreams. When will I grow up and be like my father, dead? For 2.5 wars I have been here in this room, whose window is a grave that I'm afraid of opening. There is a mirror on the wall. When I stand before it, my bones laugh, and I hear death's fingers tickling the door. I place my ear on the belly of this moment, and I hear wailing. I put it on another moment. I hear the same. A poem called Photograph, subtitle of an Iraqi boy on the front page of the New York Times, which is about what it says it's about, and I clipped the piece, and for a few months I wanted to write something about it, and then it came. He sat at the edge of the truck, 8 or 9 years old, surrounded by his family. His father, mother, and 5 siblings were asleep. His head was buried in his hands. All the clouds of the world were waiting on the threshold of his eyes. The tall man wiped off the sweat and started digging the 7th grave. I guess one of the challenges of writing about this is how to deal with it, but I've been reading a lot about the mythology, about the underworld, and just thinking of the numbers of casualties, so this one is kind of about that. It's entitled about a postcard from the underworld. I have never seen the sun. It does not rise here. My father saw it there before his death. He tells me about it all the time, about its ever-burning flames. Like a candle, he said, lit by the gods, never to be extinguished. Not like the one I'm holding now, here. He taught me how to put these bodies back together, cover them with feathers, so they could roam the darkness. Sometimes an arm or a leg remains, and I put it in the corner and wait for the piles they bring the next day. I will ask my father about the eye he hung on the wall a week ago. It is still shedding tears, and I wonder if it is longing for its sister or for the sun. I guess another topic is seeing soldiers. I remember in Iraq seeing soldiers, and I understand they're victims, but one cannot help but think that the soldiers are going to go and are going to kill other humans. And the same strikes me here as when I travel sometimes, when I see soldiers about to be shipped to Afghanistan or Iraq. So this one is about seeing them at the El Paso airport. I was going to Mexico to a poetry reading in Juarez, and it's called Crossing. Here at El Paso airport, I wait for Valentina, who will take me to the other side to read poems like this one in Juarez. Valentina is late. Soldiers are standing in line, laughing, teasing one another. I was going to rate like hyenas about to smell their prey, but I probably shouldn't dehumanize them. They are peaceful now, waiting, their uniforms the color of desert-stained sand. Their boots are clean and ready to step on the sand of faces far away there, where other men stand in a long line, waiting for death. And another one about what a veteran who used to I used to see outside around the corner. It's called a sign. He pours whiskey on time, making a home in sleep. One wall is enough for his back. Yesterday's paper makes for a ceiling. Life is postponed for now, but the ghosts still roaming his past are always on time, panting. Every moment is an open grave, a window to be shut. He quarrels with the void. He's mad, the passers-by think. He places an ear to the ground. More graves are being dug. Ghosts will wave from newspapers. He runs away, leaving the piece of cardboard on the ground. It reads, Gulf War veteran. One night in many cities, we leaned on the trunk of a palm tree, which has been burning for years, but its shadow insists on keeping us company, even on cold nights. The fronds wave farewell through the windows of an old song about the river, before its waves suffocated with corpses. The song drowns in the river, and we sit on a third bank everywhere, watching. There is enough wine tonight for the ghosts of the dead who just joined our table. Tomorrow, we must take their corpses out of the song and shroud them with words. There were reports about the use of phosphorus, white phosphorus, in the war. And a few months ago, it came out that it was causing horrendous birth defects in Iraq. Also was used by the Israelis in their Gaza incursion. And so this is called phosphorus. When I was a kid, the tail end of my bike had a red reflector. It glowed in the dark, like the eyes of a cat, illuminated by the headlights of distant cars, tiny bits of phosphorus. Tiny bits of phosphorus, white phosphorus, illuminated the skies of Fallujah 5 years ago, and now infants are born there with 2 heads or without eyes. Another challenge in terms of the Iraqi and Arab context is how or whether one should write poetry about the civil war and all the massive violence that the Iraqis are committing against the Iraqis. And I made the mistake once of watching one of those videos of when an American was beheaded, because I thought that we should and we should not at least see what's happening. So this one, but it haunted me for a long time. So this is entitled A Head. I wasn't a tree or a sheep, but they muttered a few words and beheaded me with a dull knife. My head rolled far, and I saw myself kneeling, hands tied behind my back. The fountain of blood died a few seconds later, and they went away without even looking back. Hours later, the hungry dogs came sniffing. Take your share and leave nothing of my body, I said. I begged them, please leave my head here in the pit of this poem. One entitled Dismemberment. Not about Iraq. The body, or a voice impersonating it, said, go, as of now you are all free. The eyes flew far away, joining flocks of eyes which had filled the sky, almost blocking the sun. The lips parted company without a farewell. One searched for a new face, the other for a lip that would listen to its complaints. The tired tongue sought a mute man's mouth to rest in. The hands clapped and waved to each other as they went away. The right leg appeared to be frightened and hesitant, and then it rushed to catch up with the left leg. The nose fell on the ground, and so on and so forth. As for the heart, it kept beating alone until a lost foot crushed it in the dark. Now finally, in the heart of Baghdad, there's a street called Al-Mutanabbi, named after a 10th century Arab poet, considered to be one of the best. This street is kind of the heart of the cultural life in Baghdad, where all the booksellers are. There are a few cafes where all the literati go every Friday to chat and exchange books. And in 2007, the suicide bombers chose that street as a target, killing a lot of readers and a lot of owners of the bookshops, and closing it down. And there was a movement in this country by a lot of owners of bookshops and publishers to start a project called Al-Mutanabbi Street Starts Here, where they would do readings, and there's an anthology as well, with a lot of poetry translated from Iraq, but also other poets in solidarity. But the anthology is not finding a publisher, because obviously it's not a very relevant topic anymore. So the last poem is a letter to Al-Mutanabbi, the street and the poet as well. And he's a controversial figure because, as all the poets did back then, still now, he wrote a lot of panegyric poetry to the ruthless rulers of the day. So I guess he has a position on violence. A letter to Al-Mutanabbi. You are right. Your words are still wings of light, always carrying you to us, sometimes carrying us to you. And your name is a green tattoo on Baghdad's tired face. Your street a forehead of a body beheaded every morning. It's just another chapter in the saga of blood and ink you knew so well. I cannot lie to you. I'm quite pessimistic. We are still etching on the walls of this cave, which is thousands of years long, signs we keep reinterpreting, and myths about a future world where we don't devour one another, and where the sun is friendly and the seas cannot inherit our fever. Some of us are digging a deeper grave, about to embrace us all. They too have their engravings, maps, philosophers, and books and poets. We can only keep dreaming of a shore for the wind and dig wells in the dark with nails of silence and solitude. We will weave an ocean out of ink for our myths, and out of words a sail or a shroud, vast enough for us all. Every book is a well around which we sit and drink to your health and try to live like you did, with death and after it. Thank you.
So much, Elena and John, for organising this event. So my short talk is called Makes Nothing Happen, which I guess resonates a little bit with what Paolo was just saying. The subtitle is Desire for the Poetic, Embarrassment About Poetry. During the Second World War, British poets found themselves regularly tormented by newspaper headlines asking, where are the war poets? The mould had been set by the extraordinary centrality of the poets of World War I, poets like Rupert Brooke, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, who continue, at least in English language discussions, to overshadow any contemporary discussion of the relationship between poetry and violence. The answer to the question, as Horizon magazine pointed out in the 40s, was under your nose. That was where the war poets were. But the World War II poets were not writing the same kind of poetry as their Great War predecessors. The conditions of legibility had changed. Poems that treated the enemy with compassion, or that expressed skepticism about propaganda, or the all-encompassing claims of the official war culture to represent the totality of the conflict for its citizens, were hard to make sense of. Pacifist poems or avant-garde experiments
were readily coded as unpatriotic and downright obscene. They still are, I think. In wartime especially, poets get caught between the contradictory demands placed upon them. I'm not speaking as a poet, at least in the last 20 years, anyway, after some teenage forays. On the one hand, as W.H. Auden declared in memory of W.B. Yeats in February 1939, on the eve of World War II, poetry is supposed to be autonomous, prized for its non-instrumental dimension, its very lack of utility. For poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its saying, where executives would never want to temper. It flows south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives, a way of happening, a mouth. But then again, poets are expert practitioners of rhetoric, living out a privileged relationship to language, all too aware of its capacity to manipulate and sway emotion. In the next section of the poem, Auden's poetic persona continues, time that is intolerant of the brave and the innocent, and indifferent in a week to a beautiful physique, worships language and forgives everyone by whom it lives, pardons cowardice, conceit, lays its honours at their feet. Poetry might make nothing happen, as Auden declared, but the stakes were extremely high for the symbolic struggle over the authority, voice and role of war poets. In our own wartime, 9 years in Afghanistan, 7 long years in Iraq, longer than the US was involved in World War II, steadily approaching the bloody duration of the Vietnam War, the place of the war poet seems to have been supplanted by that of the war reporter or the combat soldier's memoir. The unstable upstart genre of creative non-fiction and reportage has elbowed aside the lyric poem as the privileged form in which to represent the individual's struggle for a perspective on war or our collective response to violence. Yet there still is a profound appetite for and investment in poetic language in our own disturbed and disturbing culture of war. To take one conspicuous recent example, Catherine Bigelow's recent Oscar-winning film The Hurt Lockers' success as the first bankable fiction film about the Iraq War is constantly attributed to its mixture of realism and the poetic. Seemingly, there must have been no poetry, nothing poetic, in the 100+ documentary and fiction films made about the war to date, including even the documentary about Baghdad that featured poet Sinan Antoon returning to Baghdad in 2003. There's a certain unease and ambivalence visible about the poetry that has tried to represent the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, or the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. To take another recent example, the celebrated poetry collection of Iraq War veteran Brian Turner, entitled Here Bullet, receives glowing reviews from readers on Amazon.com's website and attracted much media attention when it was published in 2005. Yet the somewhat puzzling Publisher's Weekly capsule review on Amazon declares, quote, "The verse in this book is not good, but it is in a cultural moment that includes Cindy Sheehan timely." The capsule review cites, quote, his poems whose titles precisely describe their contents: the nightmarish dispersal of the Baghdad Zoo, the infamous Highway 1, the Highway of Death, the Al-Harishma Weapons Market, Body Bags, Najaf 1820, Dreams from the Malaria Pills, Katyusha Rockets, Observation Post number 798, £2,000. Along they continue with medevac's, translators, civilians and much more. The review concludes, Turner earned an MFA from the University of Oregon before joining the Army. His work is straightforward and direct. It highlights the violence and death of the war in a manner little seen elsewhere. The implication is that only poetry written by a combatant, even with an MFA, can carry the authority of experience. Yet it will pay a price aesthetically, being weighed down by the prosaic or by its realism. The poetry of non-combatants, on the other hand, which is often more formally polished or experimental, is often delegitimized by the seeming lack of first-hand experience or the combat authority of its writers. In a more comic vein, there was a prosaic swipe at the reams of autobiographical war poetry to be found on countless internet blogs out there. In the first season of Dennis Leary's comedy drama Rescue Me, which some of you may have seen on cable, it was one of the few TV shows to tackle full-on the impact of September 11th on a group of post-traumatic and unruly firemen in a downtown firehouse. So in episode 6, Lieutenant Kenny Shea attends a 9/11 support group to read the poetry he's been secretly writing about his experiences during the terrorist attack that killed many of his fellow NYFD buddies. He's been told that his poetry is appallingly bad by his wife, no less, the worst shit she ever saw. But he seeks vindication in the poetry reading, albeit covertly. But to his horror and indignation, he discovers that none of the traumatized support group members who respectfully listen to his dreadful verse has actually been directly involved in the World Trade Center attacks. He scornfully denounces them as, quote, a bunch of pussies, unquote, and thanks the disturbed and scandalized psychologist who pleads with him not to leave. No thanks, Doc. This has been very cathartic for me. I'll never write this shitty poetry again, he said, slamming the door, flinging down the folder of his carefully typed up poetry, his damaged masculinity restored, and his secret safe to return to the firehouse. He's briefly violated the taboo on seeking therapy, and now his secret is safe. Poetry that's embedded in experience gets airtime briefly, but is inadmissible to the precincts of poetry with a capital P. Poetry embedded in language is closer to the canon, but is easily rendered invisible and illegible. This double bind is particularly acute in our era of media consolidation and embedded reporting. As Turner declares in a prefatory poem to Here Bullet, this is a language made of blood. It is made of sand and time. To be spoken, it must be earned. Poets who are co-opted, seduced, and monumentalized by the official war culture, of course, risk rapid obsolescence and accusations of propaganda and selling out. In the end, they often become embarrassments. Those who adopt an overtly pacifist or anti-war position, like the poems circulated by the organization Poets Against the War in 2003, for example, are all too readily marginalized and rendered invisible by media count by fears of being labeled unpatriotic. British poet C.D. Lewis captured this dilemma in his ironically titled poem, Where Are the War Poets?, written in 1941, while he was producing propaganda at the British Ministry of Information. They who in folly or mere greed enslaved religion, markets, laws, borrow our language now and bid us to speak up in freedom's cause. It is the logic of our times, no subject for immortal verse, that we who lived by honest dreams defend the bad against the worse. The honest dreams he refers to, of course, are the left political commitment of the Auden generation in the 1930s, now co-opted by the Ministry of Information to write propaganda. This formal hierarchy, conservative, realist, combatant versus subversive, experimental, and non-combatant, is deeply enshrined in modern poetic tradition. But it only ends up reinforcing the great divide between the frontline soldier poet and the civilian homefront writer, either in the United States, Britain, or in Iran, for that matter. Despite this ambivalence towards poetry, the prose works that have been most celebrated in the past few years nevertheless share a common investment in the cultural capital and aesthetic force of war poetry. Since the publication of Anthony Swofford's extraordinary memoir, Jarhead, memoirs and reportage alike feature climactic scenes of poetic violence, in which the narrating voice confronts a revelatory encounter with horrifying violence rendered in poetic, highly aestheticized language. I think, for example, of the notorious field fuck section of Jarhead, or the bar brawl after Swaff's best friend's funeral. This was a dimension to this memoir that was singularly missed in the film adaptation of Jarhead. It replaced the springy obscenity, the violently poetic qualities of the memoir with a different kind of aestheticizing representation of the war experience, I think. There are also the scenes like that in Dexter Filkins' recent celebrated book of reportage, The Forever War, in which the war correspondent encounters the corpses of 3 Iraqis shot while running backward near the Diyala River. The narrator finds a scrap of paper on which is written, "O God, creator of all things, please bind up all my wounds." He then listens to a Marine officer speak of his lack of comprehension of the combat that he's just been through on this bridge into Iraq, into Baghdad, and then Filkins is told by a Marine colonel, "Get out of my unit." There's the scene also in Generation Kill, an embedded memoir by Rolling Stone journalist Evan Wright, in which Wright's narrator witnesses the mother of a Bedouin boy needlessly shot by a Marine recon gunner. He describes the way her robe falls open over her 12-year-old son's bullet-holed body. She has a striking, beautiful face. She's half naked. Somehow, in her effort to drag her son across the fields, her shawl has come undone in the front. Her breasts are exposed. She's on her knees, praying with her head tilted up, talking non-stop, though no words come out. She turns to me and continues talking, still making no sound. She looks me in the eye. I expect her to be angry, but instead she keeps talking silently, rolling her eyes up to heaven, then back to me. She seems to be pleading. "This kid's been zipped with 5.56 rounds, Doc Bryan shouts, referring to a caliber of bullet commonly used in American weapons. Marines shot this boy. He has his medical kit out, rubber gloves on, and is frantically cutting off the kid's filthy clothes, checking his vital signs and railing at the top of his lungs. These fucking jackasses," he says, "trigger-happy motherfuckers." The scene of poetic violence, as you can hear, in its sort of disquietingly misogynist and voyeuristic qualities, passes rapidly, shifting the reader's attention to the Marines' anger at this collateral damage and their struggle to get the 12-year-old boy medevaced out by embarrassing their indifferent commanding officer. A poet perhaps might have broken the woman's silence, explored giving her a voice, but there I might be venturing into the terrain of the prescriptive, of the ethical. Perhaps I should stick with the makes nothing happen and shut up about it. But there's something objectionable, I think, about the appropriation of poetic language in these memoirs that gives pause for thought. These scenes tend to be lyric, if not lyrical, in that they stop the narrative and demand that the reader confront overdetermined, highly charged symbolic language, which is offered as indicative of a higher order of meaning, both individual for the narrator and collective for the armed body of men and women in uniform and or the audience back home. To draw to a close, this profound ambivalence about poetry and poetic suggests something revealing, I would suggest, about the relationship between poetry and violence. Poets are caught between the too little to say of the extremes of war experience and the too much said of war culture, between the limits of representation inflicted on the sensitive mind by combat or war trauma, and the overabundance of clamouring voices and media claiming to speak the meaning of the conflict on behalf of those on the ground, between the glare and blare of celebrity and the monumentalizing logic of official recognition and the suffocating marginal silence of the sidelines. The new twist on this seductive game lies in the success of the censorship and the legitimation and authority given to these embedded voices. We're constantly told that war has become a futuristic state analogous to the subprime derivative and toxic investment products packaged by the likes of Goldman Sachs, far too complex and fast-moving for the average citizen to understand. A game best left to the experts and not include the poets. So too, the claim that this new high-tech world of predator drones and counterinsurgency demands a different kind of rationality and leadership. We must trust in the new management team's grasp on the poetic lexicon of future warfare. The futurist discourse of the war makers, and it's no accident, I would suggest here, that Hart Seeley was able, in his satirical book, Found Poetry, Pieces of Intelligence, to take the speeches of Donald Rumsfeld and reformat them as poetry. I would suggest that the futurist discourse of the war makers needs poetic language to project an image of its own futurity. It also helps paper over the gaps and silences, the evasions and the half-truths. Sadly, Rumsfeld may have gone. He was the only official to be fired by President Bush, but the detainees are still being held at Guantanamo and Bagram Airfield, and the $650 billion plus defense budget is steadily higher under President Obama than under George W. Bush. There's an underlying continuity there, which again should spark reflection and outrage. And I speak as someone who's deeply supportive of, the change that President Obama came into office to achieve. The real obstacle to close to understanding the realities of war, I would suggest, is more prosaic than futurist mythology. It lies in secrecy, censorship, and media control. Surely this is one role for the poets in the present crisis, to refuse the seductions of the embedded narrative and to make us look more closely at the corruptions of language involved in official war culture and strategic discourse. This will require not only the poetry of pity and warning, as Wilfred Owen put it, not only a poetry of witnessing, but also of satire and outrage. We know how powerful and pervasive is the imaginary of war. It saturates our entertainment and our culture of low-intensity violence, even as we turn our eyes away from the horrific realities of warfare for soldiers and civilians alike. What does the imaginary, the imagery of peace look like? How can we imagine it? A task for a poet to